Hello and welcome to the Broadcast Newswrap, your shorthand guide to the week's TV news stories featuring the commentators and experts you deserve alongside the broadcast editorial team. The UK news landscape is about to swell, with new entrants, GB News and News UK, busily scaling up their operations ahead of their launches later this year. This week, Newswrap is joined by 5 News editor Cait FitzSimons and media consultant and journalist Ben Fenton, alongside me, John Elms, to assess the state of play, including how incomers will tackle concerns over bias and impartiality, the way news outlets are combating viewer fatigue, and the need to entertain while delivering the facts. All that, and we'll be checking in with what our guests have had on their TV sets in our evergreen segment, What We've Been Watching. Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Broadcast Newswrap. It is a pleasure to be joined today by a couple of news gurus and with me on the podcast today we have Cait FitzSimons, editor at 5 News, which is made by ITN. Cait has also previously served as a program editor and a producer at Sky. And I'm also joined by Ben Fenton, a journalist, author and media consultant and former chief media correspondent of the Financial Times. It's a pleasure to have you on. How are you all doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good, thank you.
Fantastic. Now, before we get going, we should also be said, I think, Ben, that you've, in your media consultancy work, your paths have crossed with ITN. Is that true?
I have, yes, done some work for ITN. I do some work for ITN, but that won't stop me being harsh if I feel it's necessary to be so.
I'd expect nothing less.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, we've seen a flurry of interesting stories about new entrants to the news landscape, really focused around the Andrew Neil chaired GB News and also News UK TV or whatever that's going to be called. I'm not sure that's the final one, but I spoke with David Rhodes last week. And I think from two people who are well versed in the news world and who still work in the news world, I'd perhaps just get your viewpoint on these new entrants and what they're going to bring, you think, to the news landscape, maybe starting with UK.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting decision and the timing in particular of it, and also interesting that there were these two sort of groups working in parallel until they sort of announced what they were doing, and particularly the discussion around, you know, the sort of claims that they may be more right-leaning. So I think there was obviously something in the air that was sort of picked up in terms of provision. And I think, you know, I mean, I work for an organisation that provides news for the 3 main commercial broadcasters. We also provide news for many online outlets and kind of broadcasters beyond that. So for us, kind of, you know, a wide range of output is a good thing because that's how we kind of function and how we look at the world. So I think that's my initial thought. And, you know, I have to say, I think it's really interesting to see what kind of output as a program maker, what kind of output they're actually going to be looking at. You know, it's clear already that there are different kind of levels of scale of what they'll be delivering. So I think I'll be really curious to see what their content looks like and what it becomes, because there's quite a broad range that it could fit within. So I think it'll be fascinating to see what that actually comes out as program-wise. I mean, I think in a way they've set themselves a little bit of a challenge by talking about not doing breaking news, because actually we are in what has been over a number of years now the busiest news period that I can remember as a journalist. The consistency and the scale and the level of the stories, both in kind of events around elections and also obviously the pandemic. So I think, you know, saying that you are not going to plug into some of that might be actually kind of not taking advantage of a sort of a great opportunity, which I think I'll be interested to see. Again, that's why I think one of the reasons why I'll be interested to see what they come out. And I do think that, you know, for me, television is about words and pictures. So a lot of the reading that I've done does seem to imply this is going to be more along the lines of, I'm not being dismissive, more like TV on the radio on the TV, sorry, where you've got much more about talking heads and things like that rather than necessarily around picture. So I'll be, as I say, that's another thing that I'll be keen to see if they actually move into filmmaking or if they're commissioning those kind of ways of telling stories, because if they're not breaking news, they may well have space for that. So those kind of formats, you know, John McAndrew, and particularly for GB News, you know, has a long tradition of working in television broadcasting. So, you know, I would expect that could be a potential, but it may be that they just stay with the straight kind of more straightforward talking head style of output.
Ben, bringing you in on this, from what Cait said, and what has also been written about, what I've written about tomorrow, I've got an interview with. We're recording this on the 18th of February, going out on the 19th, and I've got an article about GB News in which I interviewed John McAndrew about the program making. Something that's been reflected around the rhetoric around GB News is that it might be divisive, right-leaning programming, and John, in his interview with me, was quick to say that it wouldn't be shouty, hateful, and divisive. Just on the idea of bias and bringing that to the news landscape, Ben, what do you think the challenge that GB News has to kind of ensure that all this noise around them is just noise?
Well, I suppose the first thing they've got to do is to show that they will stay within the broadcasting code operated by Ofcom, which will require them in broad terms to be impartial. That applies much more to news broadcasters in general and rolling news services in particular at time of a general election, when you get your stopwatch out, as Cait will know better than I, and you really have to show impartiality in numbers. The rest of the time, it's much more a case of feel and the ability, if a channel is accused of showing an overall bias and it comes to an Ofcom adjudication, that they can then say, well, set against that, we can play you this, where we showed, a balance of views. And that's the LBC model, I think, on radio, where you've got sort of Nigel Farage and you've also got James O'Brien, and you can balance that. Now, personally, I don't find that kind of broadcasting for myself very interesting, because I won't tell you which side of the choir stall I might be on, but I don't particularly like being a choir member and being preached to. I don't find that interesting broadcasting. I want to hear people who have set out to give both sides of the story themselves with one voice, if you like, than one voice saying one thing and one voice saying the other. I believe fundamentally that you achieve fairness in society by talking to each other about things and deciding which elements of each argument are to be preserved and ought to form a balance, than you do by shouting at each other and saying you're wrong and I'm right. So I personally don't think I'm going to be much of a viewer of a station that does that. From my personal perspective, though, I think one of the things I'm really interested to see about the economics of GB News. People talk about it being sort of British Fox TV. Let's try and examine that a little bit. Fox Television makes a fortune in the United States. One of the reasons why Rupert Murdoch has hung on to it for so long, and it's got away with an awful lot of stuff that other people wouldn't have done. They make a lot of money through two forms. One from advertising, because they get good ratings for what they are, and they have an influential audience in many ways. And the other is that they get paid carriage fees by cable stations. Now, I would be very surprised if GB News earns a penny out of carriage fees, because where's their audience? They aren't bringing anything to cable that cable hasn't already got. They might even be charged money for it. So if you look at an excellent news operation like Sky, which I am a great admirer of Sky and people who've worked for it, John McAndrew, John Riley, I think, Christina Nicolotti-Squires, some of the best journalists working in the UK. They produce fabulous television. They get pretty good audiences, especially if you sort of reference it to the general Sky audience. And it loses £20 million a year. So given that, that's part of Sky's own organisation, so they're obviously not going to charge it any money, I don't see that GB News has got an economic model. I may be wrong. It may be that there's a massive appetite for this, that people will want to advertise against this kind of programming. I'd be a bit surprised I'd be more than a bit surprised if that turned out to be the case. So I think the economics will be really interesting. On a more principled level, if you like, I don't like the argument that this channel is necessary to provide balance against the bias of other channels. Now, I don't think John McAndrews made that argument, but I have seen it made on their behalf. And it certainly is the theme, the mood music coming from the funders and the founders has been along those lines. I don't like that predicate because, as I say, I don't like the idea of having one side and the other side.
Does Ben have a point about what the aim, what the ultimate goal for GB News? And let's also bring in the idea of News UK TV as well, because they're the entrant to the market, and they're going to be doing a slightly different thing. I think their distribution's mainly online.
Well, I mean, the business model of news is a kind of a mysterious thing, and obviously I've worked in both kind of strict public service broadcasters for ITN, but also for Sky. So I've sort of seen the sort of both sides of it, and I've always found it a somewhat bewildering concept. So I think I don't have the sort of, no doubt, massive amounts of research and in detail that these organizations have. So they must assume that there is a core audience there that they can attract, and they must think that they can make money from them through advertising, because, as you say, I don't think that there's any other way that would function. Or there's an almost evangelical feel to it, which is that they feel that they sort of owe it to the broadcasting landscape. But I mean, I'm not sure if those people really exist in terms of kind of, granting us this sort of variety of opinion. I mean, I have to say, I agree. I feel like that idea of kind of confrontation, learning through confrontation for a broadcaster is not something that feels particularly modern, if nothing else. It feels quite an old-fashioned way about going around things, and particularly in a time when audiences are genuinely really in want of good information, solid information that they can rely on for their actual lives at the moment. The idea that somehow that sort of confrontational, divisive form would work, and as you said, John McAndrews talked about that not being what they're aiming at. So then if you're then staying in a model where it is discussion, it's what are you actually aiming for out of those discussions? So as I say, that I'm curious to see how that would unwind, and I'm as a viewer, I'm not sure how long people will stay watching that kind of content. I mean, there are various models of this on the BBC, ITV, across output, and they get audiences, but they don't get huge audiences. And as a new challenger, you've got that hill to climb already. So I'm not totally sure sort of how that will work out. I think it's a risky venture. It has a lot that could go wrong for them.
It's also worth pointing out that in the Fox News model, they have both news broadcasts, sort of, if you like, breaking news reporting, and then they have the comment section. And it's the comment section, it's the Tucker Carlsons, and as was the Bill O'Reillys. These are the people. Sean Hannity are the people from whom it has got its reputation for being a somewhat rabid news outlet. So if GB News is saying, well, they're going to do the Sean Hannity and the Tucker Carlson bits, but they're not going to do the news bits, where actually Fox was, shall we say, more fair and balanced, to use its own slogan, then I'm not sure that model works somehow. I don't know. It doesn't. It feels somewhat unbalanced in itself, just as a model. It's like newspapers serve up news and comments and features and sport and business, etc., etc. There's a mixed diet when you pick up a newspaper in the old-fashioned way, or when you log on to its website, when you look at its homepage. It's not a very balanced diet to have just commentary.
John did say that the GB News, and it was also said by News UK, David Rhodes, last week, that both kind of outlets would show the full gamut of news. It's not just going to be political debate. They're going to be covering, entertainment, sport, and what you would expect from a news coverage. And I think from GB News's standpoint, they're very keen on saying the fact that they're hiring 120 journalists around the country to provide stories, feed in stories from the regions.
I'd be massively excited if GB News provides a really good regional news service. It's desperately needed in this country to have more reporting on what's going on in the regions and nations of the United Kingdom, for reasons of unity as much as anything else. So yeah, that would be great, and I'm sure Cait shares that point of view. I mean,
although that's a huge commitment, doing regional news well, as we know, is, I mean, incredibly, and the level of commitment to do that thoroughly is quite a you know, I know their sort of recruitment is quite a large one, but you know, that's a lot of people that you are doing that. So again, it's how the journalists turn into what they're doing into content. You know, that's what's not clear in terms of the scale and ambition of that for me.
Sure, absolutely. I'm just changing tack to broaden this out about news, the state of the news landscape in the UK, particularly when we've got two new entrants coming in. Cait, from your perspective and on Channel 5, what's the general attitude towards news outlets at the moment? We're in a very difficult time. Obviously, that's an understatement, but news outlets are getting under the microscope even more because they're informing us about what's going on, and often what's going on is not what people want to hear at the moment. And what's it like trying to navigate the arguments and calls and opposition of bias and all that kind of thing as a news outlet?
Yeah, I mean, I think increasingly over the last few years, regulation, which by broadcasters in the wider sense was sometimes seen as a little bit of a burden to carry, has actually started to become a real asset. The sort of the kind of the fact that we work to an established level of rules which are they are applied and they can seem to be kept to is an incredibly value thing, and we saw how audiences valued that during the kind of the pandemic and ongoingly. But yes, I think pandemic fatigue and also people's increasingly concerns over, say, the delivery of the vaccine and how that's going has shown there's still a real fracturing of opinion in the public. My program's on at 5 p.m. and 6:30. I always say that my audience, my competition isn't other broadcasters. It's actually real life. The kids coming home from school, you're putting the dinner on, or you're getting up and going for a night shift. That's what we're competing against. So we've always gone out of our way to try and make programs that pull people in, have a variety of content that engage, talk to people on their level. I know this is a lot of thing that a lot of editors will say, but it's something that we're really keen on our program. So actually the issues around fatigue is probably slightly less for us, because that's something we're not necessarily fighting fatigue, but we're fighting the world. And so we always make a real effort to make our programs feel well-rounded. People often disdain the kind of lighter end at the end of the program, but I'm a big fan of saying when somebody's done something brilliant, let's cheer about that, as well as everything else that's going on. And I feel like that's increasingly becoming a more accepted way about thinking about news. It's not just a list of stories that people need to care about, and here you are. We are here to tell you about what's important in your world and make it an engaging process. And then I think when it comes to that, the increasing division around, say, for instance, vaccines, it's about being thorough, it's about being rigorous, making sure that what you put on air is tested and sourced and that you can stand it up against any measure, because that's your best defense in any situation. And that's all you can do. We beyond that, we have to kind of keep the trust with our audiences and hope that they stay with us, whether or not we echo back to them what they hope to hear, or indeed what's actually going on.
Has news outlets' remit broadened to inform and also entertain a bit in this time? Or is that just like a TV journalist's anticipation of wanting to have TV that entertains?
As a newspaper reporter, which I was for 30 years, I always admired television journalists because they had to live by the dictum of no pictures, no story. So that you have, if you like, some form of entertainment in the broadest sense from having video. That is an entertainment for the eyes. It may be bad news, or it may be very amusing news. We only had words with the pictures provided by our photographer colleagues and so on. And so, the tone in which you write has always been a really important thing. And the mixture of that on a newspaper page was always really, really important, has always been really, really important. The Daily Telegraph, I worked there for 20 years. I was the chief reporter there. It almost never appeared without what we called a basement story at the bottom of page one. I don't think they have them really anymore. It was a light-hearted story. It was a funny thing. I remember writing one about some scientists who had calculated what the ideal speed for tomato ketchup was, which got more feedback than virtually any other story I think I ever wrote in out of 8,000 bylines. So entertainment in its broad sense has always got to be part of news. You cannot expect people to sit there and listen to, when the BBC started in the 1920s, it just used to have talks, and you just sat there and listened to somebody drone on, no doubt, for ages. They weren't allowed to do news because the newspapers said, that's our job. We can't let this newfangled BBC start doing news. Does that sound familiar in any way? Nothing has changed, really, has it? But no, entertainment. If you don't have entertainment, you don't have news, frankly, because people just won't listen. But
if you look back to ITN, the early days of ITN, when ITN really sort of established what a news package looked like. Reporters in front of the piece to camera. It's about showing people things and being at the heart of the story. That, as you say, that has an element of entertainment to it, absolutely.
But just to bring back in these new entrants, to many, watching a debate program, and we've got them in the Daily Politics and Question Time on mainstream TV already. People like watching that as entertainment. They might not agree with the views being said, but they watch it to do that. So is there a somewhat a place for those debate shows, as long as people aren't spreading misinformation?
Well, it doesn't have to be slapstick, does it? I mean, I think you can do news in an entertaining way. You can write about ketchup or whatever it might happen to be. You don't have to sort of make it into a sort of a farcical show. It can be just an entertaining, just entertaining. It doesn't have to be farcical. And I think that I think that, for instance, Question Time on the BBC did itself no favors whatsoever, especially during Brexit debates and the last election campaign. I think some of their choice of guests were frankly, unbalanced. And they were looking for, and I'm sorry, and I think this is a fault of newspapers and television news, but that's what newspapers have always done, is try to shock people into reading it. And that's why television news is so important and, so much better in many ways than newspaper news. You can't, I just think you can't try to shock people in news programs if you're trying to also get them to accept and believe in the information that you're putting over, right? So I realize I sound rather old-fashioned, but certain things are more serious. Certain things actually don't need to be accompanied with bells and whistles.
I think challenging isn't the same as adversarial necessarily, but that's very much in the presenter or the kind of the ringmaster or mistress of the program and the people that you have on, and that those are very serious choices to be made. And I think for a long time the sort of guess getting on some output possibly was a little bit kind of, you fit into this box, you fit into this box. And actually, if you're going to focus on that kind of output, you need to take that entire process much more seriously. There needs to be a lot more work on it done, both in terms of background and checks to make sure that you don't have anybody who might start pushing out misinformation, but also in terms of what you are going to learn from that conversation. If you have two people who have slightly opposing views, where is the kind of joining together where information will be passed on to the viewer? Because that, as I say, at the moment, that is what viewers want. They want to know about the things that are really quite vital to their world. So if you constantly just have the kind of your one side and another, where is the fact? And that becomes really difficult. And if that is, as I say, that's why I'm keen to see this sort of scheduling on this, particularly obviously GB News, as it seems to be on air for much longer. How do you sustain that over a day of output? What does that schedule look like?
I think that the other thing is that these sorts of programs generally blur reporting and commentary. And I've always thought that blurring commentary and news reporting is a bad idea. And I've never wanted to work for newspapers that did that. And, I'm a bit of a snob maybe in that regard, but sue me. I think that a lot of the problems we face in the public sphere at the moment are down to the fact that people are unable to differentiate fact from opinion. And that's not a good place to be for any kind of political discourse. That and the undermining of expertise and people saying we can't even tell what facts are anymore, put us in a bad place. And it's, journalists hold some responsibility for that, not just politicians. But I think if you take the general feel of broadcast news at the moment has been shaped by PR people like me and politicians refusing to debate each other. So they won't go on Cait's programs against another politician anymore, like they did when I was younger, and so therefore the journalist has to take the place of the opponent. And that, to someone who doesn't have a lot of time to understand the sophisticated nature of news broadcasting, is putting them in the place of being a player, and that has also undermined the authority of really good factual news reporting.
Thank you very much for both of your input, Cait and Ben. Before we go, obviously it would be remiss of me not to offer you the opportunity of Broadcast Newswrap's favorite section, which is, of course, what we've been watching, just to bring a bit of levity towards it at the end of some really, quite intense conversation about the news landscape. So Cait, if you'd like to kick off, what have you been watching this week?
A massive amount of escapist content. WandaVision on Disney Plus, which has been an absolute kind of revelation in terms of what TV can do with creativity and ideas, and really quite strange. Kind of taking comics and making them feel like they're modern and challenging. But also on Channel 5, an absolutely fantastic series inside the Natural History Museum, which has just been a delight of experts loving what they do and talking about it, beautifully filmed, and both a feast for the eyes, but in very different ways.
Fantastic. And Ben?
I have to confess that I've been watching Prime Suspect again. And I'm wondering just exactly whether I used to look like that when I was a reporter on some of the stories that they feature in Prime Suspect. So yes, as your listeners will no doubt have guessed by now, I do spend a lot of time living in the past.
I don't think there's a problem with that. I think TV is very keen on nostalgia and reboot, so I think you're probably in good company. But once again, thank you so much, Cait and Ben, for joining us today. It's been fantastic having your input, and thank you once again. Take care.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcast Newswrap. It has been my pleasure to host journalist and media consultant Ben Fenton and 5 News editor Cait FitzSimons on the podcast. I'm John Elms, and this edition of Newswrap has been edited by Max Goldbart. Don't forget to check out past episodes of the Newswrap on Spotify and iTunes, or via the website at www.broadcastnow.co.uk.